everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's Jessica Ward King, the StigmaCrusher here. This week I was incensed, I was enraged, I was surprised, but not really that surprised, because I encountered one of those instances of mental health stigma that we encounter all too often in our society. But it is fairly rare that you encounter it in such a glorious display in your daily life. And I guess it does sort of surprise me when it happens, because I think it shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen in this day and age when we're all supposed to be so knowledgeable about mental health, and everything is supposed to be very on the up and up about mental health, and mental health charity this and mental health hotline that, and everybody's supposed to be very woke, I guess, about mental health. And then something like this happens. Just let me tell you what happened. So I was at a course on community care, and it was nearing the end of the course. And one of the facilitators was explaining some of the reasons that you could break confidentiality when dealing with folks in the community. And almost as a throwaway said, oh yeah, and another reason that you can break confidentiality is if someone is going to harm themselves and others. Or others. Well, they usually go together. And I was just like, I'm sorry? They usually go together, or they often go together. They often go together, excuse me. And I waited, because I thought there's got to be some explanation, because up till now the course, as I said, it was almost done, was a good course, and there was no further explanation other than to go on to what you should do in that case, which I didn't want us to get to, which I'll explain in a minute. And so I interjected that you let us be clear that someone wanting to die by suicide or harm themselves is not the same as someone wanting to harm other people. And the facilitator kind of doubled down on their position that those two things are linked. And to be clear, there can be a linkage between harm of oneself and harm of others. At times, there's a linkage between usually harm of others and harm of oneself, and so the murder-suicide. But generally speaking, someone who wants to harm oneself or die by suicide or is having suicidal ideation is not a danger to others. And that's the absolutely critical message that was being left on the cutting room floor here. And that is the absolutely critical stigma that was being transmitted, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not, by the facilitator of this course, that someone who wants to harm themselves, die by suicide, who is having suicidal ideation, is in some way a danger to others, is in some way violent, and making that link between mental illness and violence against other people. And that's the link that is so often made in the media, that is so often made elsewhere in society, and that has caused so much harm to persons with lived experience of mental illness. Because, just let me give you my own example. When I was coming to terms with having mental illness and trying to wrestle with the idea of coming out with the whole identity of having mental illness, or just even telling people at all that I had a mental illness, saying I have bipolar disorder. That whole wrestling, that grappling with that idea was made so much more difficult by the idea that I thought to myself, I can't tell them this because they're going to think that I'm violent. And you know what? Even to myself in the early days when I was just coming to terms with the idea that I myself had mental illness, I said to myself, does this mean that I'm violent? Because that association between mental illness and violence is so ingrained in us, that stigma is so ingrained in us as a society, that it causes no end of harm and suffering to people with lived experience of mental illness. And it goes on to cause harm and suffering to people when they're working their way through the justice system. And if they're not guilty of a violent crime, but they have mental illness, the stigma does not play well in their favor, right? And so it's really, really difficult to grapple with this stigma in real life amongst good people. And the other thing that really got me was that the rest of the audience was just, okay. Like they didn't even hear this ginormous crash that I, heard, that weighed upon my soul. And I was now seeing red, and there was, it was thumping in my ears, and I could barely think straight. And the rest of the audience was just like, oh, did anything happen? Nope. Okay, carry on, not even hearing that we were associating mental illness with violence and just moving on. The other thing, and this is what I'll go back now to when I said I didn't want us to get to the point where we talked about what we would do with that. When you say, someone that's going to harm themselves or harm others, and then you talk about, what you do when you break that confidentiality, the logical conclusion that I'm glad we did not get to, but the logical conclusion that I feared we were going towards was that you call the police. Because that's what you do when someone's going to harm others. And that's what I feared she was going to say about this duo of person that was going to harm themselves and harm others. That when that happens, when you become aware of that instance, you call the police. Because it seems to be a thing that when someone is wanting to die by suicide, you call the police. You don't call the police. People can have suicidal ideation, can be wanting to die by suicide for a variety of reasons, in a variety of ways, to a variety of degrees, and they don't need the police to intervene. In fact, it is not even always the best. It's very rarely the best thing, and not always the safest thing for the police to come and intervene in those cases. Police aren't trained in many cases to be suicide crisis interventionists. They're not trained as mental health interventionists, right? That's not their role. If someone's going to harm others, the police is absolutely the best route to go, and that's why we don't lump the two together. They're not the same. If someone is wanting to die by suicide, if someone is wanting to harm themselves, if someone is, having suicidal ideation or intent, there are many better ways to go about assisting that person. There's the Suicide Crisis Intervention Line, 988. there's their family doctor or their psychiatrist or their psychologist or counselor or therapist. There is even potentially a clergy person would be a better fit than police officers, right? There are a variety of places you can go. There are a lot of other crisis intervention lines as well, other than 988, but 988 would be my go-to. So this was a deeply troubling experience for me, and what I did about it is, so I intervened in the moment and talked in front of the entire audience about how this was stigma and this was not okay, and how these two theoretical persons, the person who is going to harm themselves and the person who is going to harm others, were two different people that needed to be dealt with separately. But that wasn't enough. I was buzzing, and I think that the facilitator was too after my intervention. And so we had a chat afterwards. And so I found out that the facilitator was totally well-meaning and coming from a different place, and had no intention of stigmatizing the mental health community, which is what I hoped and thought and prayed for, and that is indeed the case. And that's often the case. That's the last point I want to make, which is why I bring this up. Most people are completely well-meaning and don't realize the harm they're doing when they make stigmatizing comments. The people that I've had that have said things about, like, oh, this weather is so bipolar, or, that my boss is so schizophrenic, or things like that, they don't mean to be stigmatizing. When they find out that I myself have bipolar disorder, are often, very embarrassed and apologetic that they would have done so. It's not their intention to take those words and make them something other than what they are. It's just a turn of phrase in those cases for them, and so they don't mean it that way. Now, in the case where you're literally saying something that as fact that is very stigmatizing, it's more, it takes more soul searching to go back and find the root cause of, like, where did that come from and how can we not make that happen again. And so that's where these conversations come in real handy. These conversations where we can figure out, where are we going wrong when we're examining, the way that we're thinking about things and the way that we're presenting things, and how can we do better? How can we look back at the data that we have and interpret it in a way that's not so harmful to this community of people that is 1 in 5 people in Canada, and even higher likely in the world. And so that's what we all need to be doing constantly, because nobody's immune to this, to making the mistake. I'm working really hard myself on not saying things like, that's so crazy. I'm trying to say different things instead of crazy, because it's a word that we all use, and some would argue it's just a word, but it's a word with specific meaning, and it's a word with specific meaning for my community that I don't want to be using flippantly or with stigma attached to it. And so I'm working really hard on that. And I'm not perfect. I still do it sometimes. None of us are perfect. We all have a tendency to slip up or make mistakes sometimes. That's not the problem. Making the mistake is not the problem. The problem is when we don't reflect on it and decide we're going to do better and, you know, try to correct the mistake and go forward doing better. And I think that the good news from this particular instance is that we did get to that correction, and we did get to that where we where the audience heard that the stigma had happened and the kind of the correction that needed to happen, and between us as well, myself and the facilitator, we figured out where the correction needed to happen, and I think that is a success from something that, like I said, was a very difficult experience for me. It gave me big emotions, let's put it that way. All right, that's it for this week. Take care of yourselves this week, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.
Stigma Crusher.